in general, ESG is a set of standard for how a company operates in regards to the planet and its people, right? ESG is important because socially conscious investors are now using ESG criteria to screen potential investment, right? This is the key. Environmental criteria examine how a company performs as a steward of the planet. In short, ESG ultimately impacts the company's P&L. For environmental criteria, they may include a company's energy use, waste of pollution it creates, and also the natural resources conservation. Yeah, and even like how we treat animals, right, going forward in a certain company's operation. So the criteria are often used in evaluating environmental risks of a company may face and how the company is managing those risks. For example, does it own contaminated land, or before industry occupies a land, so after they need to, let's say, exit the land, so what's the impact to that piece of land that they occupied before, right? So how does it dispose of hazardous waste, how to manage toxic emission? All these are related to comply and the environmental regulations. So yeah, this is important, and to keep our planet healthy coming forward. So in terms of social aspect, social criteria examine a company's business relationship. So does the company have a high regards for employee health and safety, the welfare of it? So does the company allocates a percentage of profit to local community? So all these are the concern. Yeah, do company employees engage in volunteer or philanthropy work? Are there stakeholders' interests being taken account? These are related to the social aspect. In Malaysia, there are quite a number of issues recently. Yeah, perhaps Ernest will talk about it later on, right? Investors also look at companies in terms of the G, the governance, right? We'll look into how accurate and how transparent in terms of, let's say, accounting and reporting methods. Yeah, investor will also look at how a company treats the shareholders. Yeah, and their right to vote is important. Yeah, is an important issue, especially public listed company and so on. Right, investor will seek assurance that the company does engage in illegal practices and avoid conflicts of interest when choose its board members. So lack of ESG may hurt a company's value. Investor will need to understand the ESG criteria going forward in beyond the ethical concern, right? Like during the COP26, this month, early of this month, in terms of robust ESG criteria being talk about climate risk going forward, company can avoid practices that involve risk and at the same time, yeah, capture the opportunity, right? So yep, in Malaysia, we see that car manufacturers emission scandal. Yeah, this can affect share price and also glove company social issues. Yep, the futures values and also the withdrawal of existing investor. All this relates to P&L. So in short, investor and investment firm look for ESG-minded companies and work together with the financial services company. Yeah, they work together. So this is important. Yeah.
Yeah. So it really seems like just ESG has increased in salience almost among sort of investors, and investors care a lot more about this than before. So we've talked about that from the investor's perspective, and I want to go to Zuliana, and I just want you to talk about it. For an individual business, an individual company, why should they care about ESG? What do businesses stand to gain or maybe lose out from following ESG principles or not following ESG principles?
Well, attention to ESG issues is becoming very critical if companies want to compete successfully in the long term, especially in today's rapidly changing business climate. Major institutional investors recognize this, and they are making it very clear that they expect the companies that they hold to take a proactive approach to ESG policies and messaging. So BlackRock, the world's largest asset managers company CEO Larry Fink when he wrote, "A company's ability to manage environmental, social, and governance matters demonstrates the leadership and good governance that is so essential to sustainable growth, which is why we are increasingly integrating these issues into our investment process." In fact, Fink has actually warned the companies that BlackRock invest in to either adopt ESG standards or face pressures in so-called proxy battles where investors vote on corporate governance matters. State Street, which is also another investment firm, they had actually put this spirit into action by voting against the re-election of directors at 400 companies that State Street said failed to make any significant effort to appoint women to all their male boards. There has been conscious efforts to ensure gender equality in workplace. In fact, Malaysia government has announced recently that public listed companies in the country must have at least one woman director on the board starting from next year. These days, diversity does not stop with just gender and race. It includes culture, age, education, socio-economic status, and mindset. The advantages of proactively tackling ESG issues goes beyond just appeasing institutional shareholders and creating a good public relations story. It can open up access to large pool of capital, build a stronger corporate brand, and promote sustainable long-term growth, benefiting companies and investors. So public listed companies can increase stock liquidity. Private companies can also gain access to a new pool of funds through sustainability-linked financing. And also, these companies will get to retain their staff and even attract new millennials, Gen Z, to work in the companies. So wouldn't you want to work in a place where your work life is defined by value, not just money? Have your voice heard, being in a workplace that practice trust, transparency, and authenticity. Employees who are passionate about the organization, who are loyal and feel valued, drive an intangible goodwill, and they will strengthen the brand of the company and improve the overall productivity of the workplace. Proactive and integrated ESG policies can certainly widen a company's competitive defense relative to other industry players. So say, for example, Starbucks, they had learned this as they were trying to expand their market share in China. So for years after entering the market, they initially struggled to gain momentum to expand their stores. However, sales had rocketed when they offered healthcare plans to their employees' parents. Starbucks had quoted, "Supporting critical illness for aging parents exemplifies what we believe is our responsibility as a global public company and honors the family values deeply rooted in the Chinese culture." And today, Starbucks has 2,000 stores in China. So executives who take steps to improve labor conditions, enhance the diversity of their teams, give back to the communities, take a stand on sustainable environmental policies, also strengthen the company's brand. As millennial in particular becomes employees, consumers, and investors, they will take good note of good corporate actors and reward them with loyalty.
Okay. Yeah, that's a pretty good summary, and I think I want to ask the next question to Sharifa actually, because these concepts are very interesting to talk about, right? Because we've just talked about how following ESG principles is actually good for business. One of the most common things you see out there is, oh yeah, sustainability and profitability are contradictory. They can't be done together. And I just want to ask Sharifa your view on this. Do you think that sustainability and profitability are necessarily contradictory? Is it possible to be both prioritizing sustainability and prioritizing profitability? What are your views on that? If you're saying anything, you are muted at the moment.
Yeah, I am. Thanks, Ernest. Okay, sustainability and profitability, if I were to just compare the words between each other, obviously it's one end to another. But in the past, people believed that sustainability investment were a sacrifice, where investment were more towards morally rather than economically motivated. But this may not be true now. And some studies have suggested that companies with good ESG practices had lower cost of capital. Of course, ESG is not new in Malaysia or in the world. So they will have a lower cost of capital, lower volatility, and they also display lower instances of bribery, fraud, and corruption over time. So this suggests in the long run that the sustainability investments are more stable and can even outperform other companies. And I'm sure my learned panelists here can quote other companies that have actually shown this to be true. But I'd like to come back to the reality of business, because I come from MOXI, Malaysian Oil and Gas Services Council, and we do have about 500 companies in the oil and gas within our association. When it comes to sustainability and profitability, it also have to be balanced with what is on the ground. We have to embrace ESG because that is the way going forward, but that has to be balanced again with survivability. So I think your equation between sustainability, profitability has to be also together with survivability. So although we go forward with sustainability and profitability, but we do also need to look at the survivability. And I'd like, the reason why I want to bring this up is it's not just nice in words and in the way we practice, but when it comes to the ground for businesses like us, these are very key important criteria that we have to consider. Now, when you look at ESG in Malaysia, as you mentioned just now, things have been going very, very fast. In Malaysia, Bursa Malaysia have introduced FTSE4 Good Index. Security Commission have introduced guidelines on SRI funds. As mentioned by Zuliana just now, sustainability reporting for public listed companies. ESG ratings are now a criteria for local and international investors, and more investors are already shifting towards sustainability investment. Now, it's something that Malaysian businesses have to embrace because you cannot ignore it. And we believe also that Malaysia companies, they are already implementing these ESG practices, but for sustainability, they believe in sustainability. But when it comes to survivability, we need to actually balance that. So you find that you need to be sustainable, you need to be profitable, but you also need to survive. So there is a lot of discussions behind that in Malaysia. We embrace ESG. ESG is the way to go for all the reasons that's been mentioned by two of my panelists. But when it comes to the ground, it's not easy as that. And I think that the students need to understand that it's more than that. So I'd like to bring this very clearly, because I find that in Malaysia also, people like this idea of ESG, renewables, but when it comes to actually having the business on the ground, you need to have other elements also in place. And with that elements, you need to have infrastructure be developed. So yeah, that is my view on that.
So certainly quite a lot to think about in Malaysia. It's not necessarily going to be an easy road ahead. And that's going to be the question I'm going to ask you, Rashid, actually, because we have all of these concerns, you know, trying to, as Sharifa said, make businesses sustainable, profitable, and, you know, survivable. But where do you just see ESG headed in the next 5 to 10 years? You know, the climate crisis is becoming more and more important in most people's minds. There seem to be social movements and governance movements popping up all across the West, especially. Where do you see ESG in Malaysia in the next 5 to 10 years? How will it change? How will it grow? Will it recede? What's your view on that?
Thanks, Ines, and thanks to WMS for inviting me to share some of my thoughts, right? So with regards to ESG, right, I mean, just a bit of background. I mean, I'm from the palm oil sector, and the palm oil sector essentially, I mean, we've been at the brunt of, you know, of scrutiny around, you know, environmental and social practices for years now. And it started off, I mean, you know, the issues on deforestation, the issues on, you know, loss of biodiversity, and that has been the sort of scrutiny that we've been facing for the past sort of 10 years. And, you know, what that has done is it has pushed the industry to sort of innovate itself, to develop sort of methodologies and approaches and ways of working to sort of, you know, to sort of try and remove deforestation within our operations. And what we've seen as well in the past few years is that there's been a lot more scrutiny and spotlight on the social side of things like labor practices, things like you know, smallholders and those sort of things. So where we see it going, right? I mean, the way that I see it is, it is evolving. So, there will be sort of, issues which are hot topics at that point in time. And then, the industry would need to, respond to it. And then, in the next few years, there's going to be, another issue which is going to that's going to be brought up. And the industry would then need to respond to it. But where I see is moving forward, right? I mean, the question that you had with regards to, the next 5 to 10 years, I mean, I can see ESG itself being more intensified. There's going to be a lot of more intensity in the next 5 to 10 years. Why? Because number one, there's a lot more awareness around the sort of issues that companies face. There's been a lot more regulation around transparency. So a lot more companies are now expected to disclose around, how they are performing, around their environmental performance or around their social performance. So a lot more transparency in that which will lead to a lot more questions on whether it is enough or whether or not it's good enough, right? And also another thing to also add on is, with the sort of the way that the planet is heading. So things like the outcome of COP26, for example, there's been a lot more pledges by countries making net zero commitments, so being net zero by 2050 or 2060 or 2070, depending on the country itself, or pledges by countries making no deforestation commitments, pledges by countries reducing the amount of methane to be emitted into the atmosphere. So what's going to happen is that these are eventually going to be translated into regulations. And regulations, and it's going to be translated. I mean, for us, it's already being translated into customer requirements, investor requirements, so on and so forth. Right. So a lot more expectation will be on from our stakeholders will be on companies to respond to this sort of issues. So I can only see that these sort of things are going to be intensified. And just to add on to what Sharifa mentioned, was talking about just now, right? I mean, why it's important to companies? I mean, the way that we see it, it's because, moving forward, this is just how companies will need to operate, right? And, people tend to, question about, what the value is on being, responsible. But, the way we see it from Sime Plantation point of view, I mean, there is value to it, right? I mean, we see it in 4 different buckets. So one is about value creation. So, what are the sort of new businesses that, a company can make, from the sort of ESG trends which are coming. So things like climate change, you have our renewables business, which is up and coming. Second is about value protection. So things like once new regulations come into place, we need to be ready so that we can continue to serve the markets that we serve. So if Europe puts in stringent environmental requirements for us to ship into Europe, we'll need to future-proof ourselves against that. And the third area is basically about risk management. And it's more about future-proofing the business, like what I mentioned just now. So the way we see it is basically, regulations going to increase, expectations are going to increase, customer requirements are going to increase. So it's better that we move now, so that we are ready for when these sort of things happen. So I mean, those are just some of the things I wanted to add, and happy to discuss further after this.
Yeah, I'm sure, and there's quite a lot to pick out in that discussion actually. But I actually want to talk about something that is related to net zero actually, which is one of those big things, because COP26 has been dominating the headlines in the last month. Everyone has heard about, pledges this, pledges that. But recently, I think sometime this year, the Malaysian government announced a commitment to net zero by 2050. And that seems pretty ambitious. And we often hear about, okay, say for example, the UK banning ICE, internal combustion engine cars by 2035 or 2040. But I want to ask Sharifa actually, what is the Malaysian government doing to achieve net zero by 2050? If you could just very quickly summarize it and then explain some of the impacts that it will have on businesses overall.
Well, as was mentioned by yourself, Malaysia recently, under the Malaysian 12 Nation Plan, actually aligned the shared prosperity initiative encompassing 3 dimensions. One is economic empowerment, environmental sustainability, and social re-engineering. So the net zero falls under environmental sustainability. And from there, currently the Malaysian government is going to come out with the energy policy that will be telling us how they intend to do that. And in there'll be the renewable and the fossil fuel developments that they have to do towards achieving this net zero economy. And also, I think, not only that, not only the 12 Malaysian plan, these are also as a result for Malaysia participating in the SDG development goals. I mean, in 2019, Malaysia was ranked 68 out of the 162 countries in the SDG index. And if you find ESG is actually wrapped around the 17 SDGs that you have. So the ESG actually encompasses certain the ESG initiative numbers, and it actually you have to actually comply to that ranking in order to actually achieve the ESG. So by virtue of being part of that, naturally will actually lead us to achieving this net zero. And of course, the COP21 and COP26, obviously that's going to be very influential in influencing our way forward. You mentioned about how this will impact businesses. Obviously, businesses, I'm from the fossil fuel industry, and that has been considered a dirty industry since ESG came out. When first ESG came out, we were like struggling to just understand what ESG means and how we're going to go forward. And suddenly we hear all this development that's going into the financial institution, where the bank, Negara, is also incorporating checklists for ESG into financial assistance and things like that. So as business on the ground, it impacts us very greatly. But business people, they move very quickly also to the requirements and the regulation that's going to be implemented, because we need to survive the business. There's no way we can stay behind and say, no, look at Kodak, look at Nokia. You know, if you say, no, I don't want this development, then you will be left behind and it will be irrelevant. So the businesses will have to embrace the new regulations, the requirements, and Malaysia is charting that path by having policies. I think that's the most important thing. We need to have first policy, then you have to have the infrastructure, then you have to have the awareness among the people that's going to be practicing it.
So since adaptation is going to be increasingly crucial for Malaysian businesses going forward, and this is actually related to one of the questions I wanted to ask Zuliana. So the COVID-19 pandemic, started in 2020, still arguably ongoing now. How has that changed ESG? How have businesses looked at ESG in light of the COVID-19 pandemic? Has anything changed? How has it changed?
So has COVID changed anything related to ESG? Yeah, absolutely, Ernest. I mean, especially on the S and the G, right? So social and governance, which is more important than ever. So social is gaining more prominence, especially after we've been hit with COVID. And that really does concentrate the mind of society and the role of corporations and governments and the responsibilities towards people, stakeholders, employees, and customers. So since the beginning of the crisis, social factors have definitely come to the fore. Human capital has never been more important, with many employees working remotely and staff well-being at the top of the agenda for employers. So giving a few examples, we see many corporates establishing HR initiatives by making sure that the company stays connected with their employees through support system, by providing call channels for those who are going through anxiety, depressive modes, working from home, flexible work policies for parents, and even providing physical safe environment when employees are back at work. So within the banking sector here, the institutions have also stuck to their social responsibility by supporting individuals and businesses through the crisis by providing moratoriums, offer easy access to liquidity through government fundings, payment deferrals, and so on. And as for the G governance, it is nothing new. All fund managers, investors have been looking at the G aspect for a long time that they have been investing. Governance is all about how well the company is run, how it protects the minority shareholders, and to what extent the protection is in place. So since the onset of COVID, corporates have faced a string of difficult decisions. like what Sharifah has also mentioned earlier, that, the company had to make difficult decisions, right? So, like, for example, take into account of dividend payments. So this is quite normal, especially when companies generally pay dividends as corporate profits to shareholders. But in the time of COVID, given the looming uncertainty on the duration of crisis, employees being laid off, there were circumstances that some corporates have to suspend and reduce dividends. We have seen prudent management temper short-term shareholders' expectations to ensure health and longevity of the businesses. And this clearly is a demonstration to the increasing importance of good governance. So COVID has certainly accelerated ESG. And what Rashid has said, it has intensified. And even once we have come to the endemic, ESG will always be here to stay. In 10, 15 years, we won't be talking about ESG. Everything will become ESG. It won't be whether this is an ESG or not, but this is going to be a default option, right? So the earlier companies adopt the ESG and take them seriously, the better off they will be.
Okay. Yeah, it seems ESG has been accelerated as a result of COVID-19, and those two factors are actually interesting: social and governance being accelerated. And I think let's talk about social, because that seems to be the one that is misunderstood, quite easily, right? Environmental seems really, really obvious. Governance seems pretty obvious, but that social element seems very, very broad. And I wanted to address this question to Rashid, actually. So what does the social element of ESG really mean when you want to simplify it and get down to the bottom of it? Is it just about, the concept of corporate social responsibility or CSR? Is it more than that? What is the social element of ESG?
Thanks for the question. I mean, it is definitely more than just corporate social responsibility, CSR, and all of this sort of donations and stuff. I mean, the way, for us in Siam Labi Plantation, the way that we see it, right, is that it is one of the pillars of our sustainability purpose, which is basically contributing to a better society. And how do you contribute to a better society? Number one is basically ensuring we implement fair labor practices. So things like the issues around forced labor, whether we're paying a decent living wage, whether or not there's any sort of human trafficking happening. How do we mitigate that risk? I mean, this is an area which has increased in sort of interest and scrutiny over the past couple of years. And for us as a company, it is an area which we're currently grappling as well. I mean, Malaysia as a country, if you've seen the report just this year itself, right? Malaysia as a country, we have been downgraded to tier 3 in the trafficking in persons report. So that's not a good position to be in, right? So what we're going to see is more and more response from the government around human trafficking, around forced labor, around living conditions, around working conditions. So this is all about fair labor practices. The second one is basically looking at human rights and around. And it sort of touches around fair labor practices as well. But human rights, how do you respect the rights of each and every one of your workers? Be it things like issues around discrimination, issues around sexual harassment, those sort of things. So it is also something which we also focus on. And if you look under human rights as well, the right for a safe working condition is also a basic human right. So your occupational safety and health, this whole issue around responding to COVID-19, for example, is also sort of under the umbrella of human rights. And then we're also looking under contributing to a better society is how do we also have a positive impact on the community as well. So for example, on our side, we operate in the most remote areas in the world, in the most poverty-stricken areas in the world. How do you ensure that wherever we operate, we provide a positive impact to the community? And it also needs to be linked with business as well. So things like providing employment to local communities, working with local communities to develop smallholder programs so that they can earn a decent living. How do we include them as much as possible in our journey so that no one is left behind. So it is basically something which is quite broad And it is something which it's not as defined as the environmental sort of metrics, because if you look at the environmental metrics, right, you put some sort of technology on it, then you'll be able to measure it, and you'll be able to sort of apply some sort of technological innovation to resolve that solution. But on the social side of things, it's a bit grayer. How do you measure human rights, for example? It is something which is still emerging.
Yeah, and those are not easy questions to answer. Social is deliberately broad, and there are a lot of issues to dig into. But I want to ask a question to you, Feng, about these social issues. So Rashid has talked a little bit about some of the social issues that Malaysian companies face. So we're talking about, human trafficking, for example. So in your view, what do you think are, like, say, for example, the 2 or 3 most important issues on the social platform for Malaysian businesses to deal with, and how should Malaysian businesses at least try to address them?
Thank you, Ernest. To echo on Rashid's social issue, like this happened to us in Malaysia just 2 to 3 years back. Yeah, this is not new. And Malaysia's supply chain was being linked with human rights forced labor issue, especially in the manufacturing plantation industry. And the specific issue was, there are so many of them talking about, let's say, international labor organizations standards. There are 17 criteria that they are looking at, right? So one of it was pertaining to agents' fees. Yeah, agents' fees being paid by employees at their home country prior to mobilize to workplace, like Malaysia, right? This is not supposed to happen. However, employer is being requested to compensate the workers, right? Reimburse the family members of the employees, as they call it, the remediation cost, right? A lot of the issues arose or arises because people are asking for how much is that, how to prove it, documentation proof, and also bank account tracking, and so on and so forth. This happened not just in Malaysia, back in the like 18th centuries, right, in South Africa, in cotton industry especially, and in Eastern Europe it happens as well, right? It's just that these 2 years, yeah, is quite become hot issues here. Right, Malaysia ratify International Labor Organization Convention and prohibits all form of slavery, forced labor, right? So, we also have Anti-Trafficking in Person, Anti-Smuggling of Migrants Act, 2007, and also provides that any person who traffics in person for the purpose of exploitation shall commit offense. Right? This is already very clear, being written in Malaysia. A lot of common practices in the past, right? We assume it was right. For example, remitting agents' fees that I talked about, retaining passport, excessive working overtime, and all other workers' welfare related to health and safety, accommodation, and so on. Right? If you ask the worker themselves, they actually prefer overtime. Right? They can earn more and remit back to their home country, but however, right, this is not correct in terms of law, and is now being not acceptable, right? Therefore, a lot of our goods being held up in US, CPB, custom, and so on, right? So, there are also other relevant laws that helps to safeguard employees' welfare, right? We have Passport Act. We have Employment Act, right? This is more for local employee. Even the Occupational Health and Safety Act, right? So all this should be implemented, enforced, and going forward. The government of Malaysia has shown commitment in eradicating forced labor by launching National Action Plan on Anti-Trafficking in Person, right? That's a period of it, right? So, however, Malaysia regulatory environment still has a lot of room to improve in terms of providing comprehensive solution to combat this issue. There are various stages of their supply chain, especially on the enforcement part, right?
Okay.
We can improve a lot. By joining association that can channel information to the industry, right? For example, in the Glove Manufacturers Association, we have MAGMA, and also Palm Oil Refiners Association, FMM. All these are the channel that the government or our society can channel those that are not aware, so that slowly we can improve, or the companies, the corporate can improve in labor-related policy adoption, drafting, and followed by implementation. So working with the right channel applies, I mean, getting the suitable number of workers and so on. These are the mechanism and implementation that needs to be reviewed and checked. A lot of companies can start with due diligence, to tackle the problem at all levels. This is what I can say. Yeah, thank you, Ernest.
Yeah, so very multifaceted issue there, like multiple things the Malaysian government is already doing and needs to do to improve it. So definitely not something that can be solved in a day. But we spent some time talking about environmental. We spent quite a bit of time talking about social factors. So let's rotate and talk about governance factors a little bit. So I want to ask Liana this question about corporate governance. If you guys have been following the news, the trial of Elizabeth Holmes, the former CEO of Theranos, has made headlines, recently over allegations of fraud, etc., etc. And my question to you, Liana, is this: from a governance perspective, what can companies learn from, the high-profile failure of Theranos?
Ernest. So Elizabeth started off a company named Theranos at the age of 19, right? So she dropped out from Stanford University after attending a few semesters in chemical engineering. So she was actually hailed as the next Steve Jobs. So if you watch the YouTube on how she presents herself, very similar to Steve Jobs in terms of how and what she wore and how she speaks. So she would wear a black turtleneck blouse whenever she gets into an interview and presentations, and has a deep voice portraying confidence and mannerism. So what Theranos promised actually, was a revolutionary blood analyzer, which can run hundreds of tests, just through a finger prick from the comfort of your own home. Now, one can imagine that this is groundbreaking, right? So whereas the current industry procedure is just to extract a syringe full of blood and test takes a couple of days, whereas for Theranos, all you need is just a drop of blood and the test will be sent to you within a couple of hours. So as Elizabeth grew her company looking for investors, she created a structure that was unusual in corporate governance. As the founder, she had complete effective control with a dual-class shareholding structure, which essentially meant that for every one vote that a shareholder can make, she has actually 100 votes. Obviously, common sense would tell you that there's something not right there, and no one should look at, and they should basically look at check and balance on the founder. So we all know corporate governance is the system of rules, practices, and processes by which a firm is directed and controlled. What it means essentially is balancing the interests of a company's stakeholders, such as shareholders, management, customers, suppliers, financiers, governments, and the community. So corporate governance also provides the framework from action plan and internal controls to performance measurements and corporate disclosure. So here in Theranos, it lacked transparency. So Elizabeth promised that more than 200 tests would be conducted with a new technology, when in fact only a dozen of tests were actually done. She had made false claims as to who were her clients. She assured her investors that projected revenues would be approximately $100 million, when in fact revenue was closer to 100,000. So she lied about the current state of development. So the board of directors also comprised of politicians, military advisors, and influencers, rather than professionals and medical experts to guide the company to move forward. Now, this is a medical related company. You are dealing with lives here. Obviously, once you have the results on the test, and if it's bad, you are supposed to go on medication. And imagine you give wrong results, wrong diagnosis, it will be a catastrophe. So the board here have no medical experiences. And in other words, the board had skill shortages. So both Elizabeth and the board were really out of their depth. So there were many flags, but really, a lot was completely ignored. Any employees that raised, ethical issues in the company were also fired, and no question were allowed. The corporate culture was run by fear and secrecy, lack of transparency and commitment around compliances. She did nothing to deal with complaints of customers or issues raised by employees. So she just went full force ahead and until she couldn't, and it all came crashing down on her. So this serves as a reminder that business owners often make bad decisions when faced with certain pressures that are perceived to be rigid. It is our obligation to commit to paying attention to the red flags, beware of the risks, and make wise choices after engaging in ethical decision-making. In large organizations, a well-structured independent corporate governance is critical to making sure an organization stays ethical and follow all laws. And today, Elizabeth Holmes, CEO, chairman, founder of Theranos, was charged with committing $700 million of fraud against its investors and the public. If convicted, she faces up to 20 years in prison and potentially billions in fine.
Yeah. Not a great situation to be in overall, and only stresses that the importance of governance to companies. It's not just something that is, oh yeah, this may affect you. This is something that actually has seriously affected. Theranos went from being, the darling of the Silicon Valley to nothing within, seconds. So we are about to hit a break, and I just want to ask one final question, and this question goes to Rashid. So we spent the better part of the last 40 to 45 minutes talking about all of these issues and covering all of them in some level of detail. But at the end of the day, for the benefit of our audience, who is mostly from a student background, why are these issues important to students? At the end of the day, why should they care?
Well, they should care, because we're talking about future-proofing ourselves, right? So, if you look at ESG, right? So, in environmental performance, we are future-proofing the planet, basically, with regards to, how companies and organizations respond to climate change, for example. On the social side of things, we're future-proofing, organizations such that, they respect, workers' rights, and they contribute to a better society. And on the governance side of things, we're also future-proofing, the organization to ensure that these sort of corporate failures do not happen in the future, right? So students should be interested in the environmental, social, and governance performance of organizations, because it's not just because it's the right thing to do. I mean, it is the right thing to do, definitely, but it also demonstrates. It also has a linkage to demonstrate value to the organization and also to society as well. And yeah, people should be interested in it.
Okay. Yeah, thank you very much for that. So I think we are just about on time for a 5-minute break. So yes, I think the MSA will inform you, but we are going to take a very quick 5-minute break. Go get some water, go get some coffee, etc. We'll be back and we'll be taking some of the questions from the floor. So thank you and see you in 5 minutes. Okay.
Growing